Hi everyone, thanks so much for joining me for another episode of my live chat Q&A. My name is Amanda Augustine and I'm the resident career expert for TopResume as well as our sister sites Top Interview and Top CV. You can at any time go to topresume.com or topcv.com in order to receive a free resume review or a free CV evaluation, depending on what you're using to pursue your job search. Before we jump into today's live chat, which is going to be all about what I would call the anatomy of a resume, I want to break it down piece by piece. What are the core things you need in every resume, and then what are some of those add-ons depending on your level of experience, your job goals, etc., and so forth. Before we really delve into that, I do want to take a minute because obviously there's a lot going on in the world today. And it's been a rough few months, and it's been a very rough week or so for many of us out there. As many of you know, last week we canceled our regularly scheduled live chat in solidarity of Blackout Tuesday. Just want to state that for both Top Resume as well as our sister sites, Top Interview and Top CV, we do believe that Black Lives Matter. And in addition to continuing to recruit and hire a diverse group of individuals for our company, my team is also committed to creating some new content. We're working on some content on how can professionals identify organizations and employers that truly walk the walk when it comes to diversity and inclusion. And in addition, I'm currently gathering resources, and so if anybody knows of any, please put them in the comments below. I'd love to add them. I'm looking for any type of resource, whether it's a networking group, it's a professional organization, but whatever is out there that is focused on helping minority groups both land meaningful work and also advance their careers. And so stay tuned. Check out Top Resume's blog. That information is coming because really the best that I think we can do is provide all the resources possible to help even the playing field. With that said, I would love to get down. I'm gonna drink some water before I choke. And talk about resumes. There we go. Hi, feeling better. Hey Daniel, thanks so much for joining us. Today, I really want to talk about dissecting a resume. What is the anatomy of a resume? What are the major components, things you should think about based on what we've learned on what recruiters are looking for, what the applicant tracking systems are looking for, what can you do to ensure that your resume is going to get noticed for all the right reasons. So to kick it off, I think I mentioned this during our last chat, but I always want to bring it up. When you're thinking about your resume, you have to remember that you are crafting it for a number of different audiences, and you're trying to satisfy the needs of all those different audiences. You want to make sure that the hiring manager, who's going to probably have a much better idea of your experience and be able to interpret it, that they really get it and they're seeing the information they need. You also need to make sure it's including information that's positioned and designed in a way so that somebody who's maybe an entry-level sourcer, an HR coordinator, somebody who's basically been given a set of keywords to look for or scan is also going to be able to quickly glance at your resume and understand why you're qualified. Thanks so much for joining us. You want to keep that in mind, and then you also want to keep this electronic system, the applicant tracking system, in mind when you're crafting your resume, because we know that that's your initial gatekeeper in so many instances when you're applying for a job. We've thrown out a stat many times in the past that says that 95% of organizations are using applicant tracking systems. 98%. I had to really go back and look and see, where am I getting that resource from? Where is that information coming from? What I found is that we are specifically talking about Fortune 500 companies, and in the latest webinar that I attended, that was only a few weeks ago, 98% of Fortune 500 companies are using some applicant tracking system. So just want to put that out there because I know a lot of people were curious about that. In today's live chat, I'm hoping to go through the different components and then open it up for Q&A, because I know there were a lot of resume questions that I didn't get to during our last chat that I would love to address. And if there are new ones that are coming in, please, if you're listening, viewing now, and you have any resume questions, feel free to type them in the comments below, and I'll try to get to all of them. Hopefully they'll just be answered in the information that I'm providing, but I also want to leave a good chunk of time for Q&A, because I know that's really valuable to so many people out there. So let's talk about the resume. In early 2019, March 2019, so a little over a year ago, TopResume released a study. We had commissioned a third-party research company to undergo this study for us, because we were trying to figure out the difference between a professionally written resume and a self-written resume, a DIY, and understand what are some of those key characteristics that tend to make a professionally written resume get noticed by an employer or recruiter for the right reasons. And there were 3 things that came up. The first was telling a compelling career narrative. What in the world does that mean? It means telling a story. How do you make sure that you leverage the professional summary at the top of your resume, in the core competency section, perhaps some key highlights? How are you making sure that you're setting the stage to tell the story about your work experience, your education, and even the things you've been doing outside of your professional career that have all led you to this certain type of job goal with this certain set of qualifications? They really want to tell the story. And I think that's important to note, because so many people think of their resume as a transcript. It's just a list of everywhere I've worked. Can't be that hard, right? But recruiters are looking for more than that. They're trying to get some more insight into you and what's led you here, and those qualifications that are beyond just looking at where you've worked. So I think it's really important to shift your mindset and stop thinking of your resume as merely a transcript of your work experience and education, and really think of it more as a marketing document. And you get to choose what information you include and what information you omit or downplay, so that you're telling the best version of your story and positioning everything towards a certain goal. That's another thing that's really important to keep in mind. Your resume should always be positioned or framed with a specific goal in mind. Do I think you need to overhaul your resume every time you apply for a job? Absolutely not. If you have to completely overhaul it, then your base resume needs some work, or you need to narrow your job goals so that all the roles you're applying for are kind of in at least one swim lane. You don't necessarily want to, if you're targeting 2 completely different directions, then you probably need 2 completely different resumes that you're working off of. But as a career coach, I will always encourage you to try and narrow that goal down to 1, because you only have 1 LinkedIn profile, and you want everything to be telling a similar story. So if you just joined me, my name is Amanda Augustine. I'm the resident career expert for TopResume, as well as our sister sites, Top Interview and Top CV. And today we're talking about the anatomy of a well-constructed resume. And right now I'm talking about a few of the differences that we've seen between professional resumes and self-written ones. And if you can nail these things in your resume, you know it's more likely to impress an employer. So we talked about how can you tell a compelling career narrative? How can you make sure that you're setting the tone for your document with a professional summary, and then supporting that information throughout your work experience? How do you start thinking of your resume more as a marketing document and less as merely a transcript of your previous experiences and education? The second is visual balance. And I think I brought this up in previous chats as well. You got to remember that if your resume gets through that electronic gatekeeper, it is going to be in front of an individual, a person, a human being who is trying to read this document, and they're reading it very quickly. The average recruiter or employer spends less than 10 seconds scanning a resume before they decide whether they're going to throw it in the no pile or they're going to set it aside to look at more closely. If they set it aside to look at more closely, they're going to spend more time on it, but you've got less than 10 seconds to really grab their attention and demonstrate why you're worth an extra look. And the white space, the layout or design of your resume really plays into that. You don't want the font so small that they have to squint to see it. You don't want to cram it all on one page. Use 2 full pages. You want to make sure that you're leveraging bullet points, bolding, highlighting, and italics. Not all those, but some of those features, you're leveraging them to call attention to the most important details when it comes to your resume. We'll get into this when we talk about work history, but I use bullet points for a very specific purpose when I'm creating a resume. And I want to make sure that that's something you're thinking about as well. So don't just think about the content that you're putting into your resume, but think about the display of that content. How you convey that information is just as important as the information itself. So something really important to keep in mind. Look for that visual balance. You want enough white space so that it's easy for them to identify the most important pieces of information that are going to support your story. And that whole story is why I'm qualified for the role you're currently filling. The third thing that employers value very highly in resumes that is sometimes challenging for the average person to communicate is their actual accomplishments and value. And so it really comes down to proof of your qualifications. Anyone can say they're a leader. Anyone can say they're great at sales. Anyone can say they're fantastic at social media. Employers are really looking for evidence, for proof. How can you demonstrate that you possess the skill set that you have? Even if you have a job that you consider more of a doer job, where it's more task oriented as opposed to, accomplishment driven, for lack of a better term. The whole idea is how can you demonstrate you're good at what you do? If you state you're good at what you do, if you state you possess a certain skill, you have to be able to back it up. And again, I want to talk about that some more when we get into talking about the professional history section of your resume. If you're just joining me, my name is Amanda Augustine, and I am the career expert for TopResume, as well as our sister sites, Top Interview and Top CV. And today we're all talking about breaking down the resume bit by bit to look at what are the essential parts that every resume should have, and then what are some of those extras that, depending on your level of experience, your career goals, you may add in or take out, that sort of thing. So now that we've gone over the 3 things that employers tend to be impressed by in a resume, they want to make sure that it tells a compelling career narrative, that it's visually easy to digest, and that it provides proof of whatever claims you're making about your skill set. Those are 3 important factors. And whenever you're looking at your resume and evaluating, do I think this resume is going to do the job, that's something you want to keep in mind. When we're talking about the applicant tracking systems, again, that's a whole nother conversation. I actually did a live chat on that where I broke it down bit by bit. We also have a great article that I wrote on, what in the world is an ATS and how does it work and what do you need to think of when you're crafting an ATS-friendly resume. So definitely keep that in mind. Okay, so let's start at the top of the resume and work our way down. Let's talk about some of the basics. Page length. A lot of people have questions about the page length. Most resumes are 2 pages long. You do not need a 1-page resume, especially if you have, several years of experience. I recommend going to at least 2 pages. Even if you're entry level, you can go to a 2nd page as long as you have enough information to truly warrant it. Don't stretch it just to get to a 2nd page. Work with what you've got, never lie. Those are, the rules. So stick to 2 pages. There are some exceptions to that rule. If you're in academia or the scientific field, you get to use an academic resume or an academic CV. Those tend to be much longer because it will have lists of publications, presentations, that sort of stuff. What's the other one that's a really long one? If you're applying for a job in the U.S. federal government, that type of resume follows a very different format, and that can tend to be longer. If you're applying for a job in the UK or another country where they require a CV as opposed to a resume for the application process, I'm not going to say that CVs are necessarily longer, that they are actually becoming more and more like a resume as time goes on, but they do use a different size paper. They use A4 as the document style, and that tends to actually be a longer page, so I guess you could technically say those are longer. So that's something to keep in mind. When it comes to fonts, it will vary in terms of font size. You basically can go anywhere from 10.5 font point to 18, and that's for the body as well as I'm talking about major headers. I typically don't go above 16 or 18 for the largest header, and then I stick around, I don't know, anywhere from like a 13, 14 for my subheadings throughout a resume on average. And then the body of the resume, the main content, is typically anywhere from 10.5 to 11 font size, but it's all going to depend on what font you use. Some are just bigger than others, and so I'm trying to keep it, to look about the same size depending on what I'm going with. When it comes to fonts, we do have an article that goes through all the different fonts that are, considered the best. I do not remember that entire list off the top of my head. There are serif fonts and there are sans serif fonts. Sans serif fonts tend to render better in a digital format. Serif fonts, which tend to have, think of Times New Roman, Cambria, those are serif fonts. I tend to stick to those when I'm working with somebody who is targeting a more traditional field, academia, that sort of thing, or perhaps going into a much more like bricks and mortars traditional organization. I tend to stick to kind of those fonts for them. For sans serif, I'm a huge fan of Calibri Light, but Calibri Light, Arial, that's just off the top of my head a few of them, but you get the idea. They tend to be simpler fonts. They're ones that are commonly used and available across multiple platforms, so Google Docs, Word, regardless of which version you have. You want something that is less likely to get misconstrued or garbled when it's going through an applicant tracking system. So that's something to keep in mind. In terms of margins around your resume, and I gotta say, these are actually details I typically don't really talk about in a live chat, so I'm kind of excited to share this information because they're really they're little things, but they're important when you're trying to construct a resume. When it comes to your margins, I have done anything from 1/2 inch to about 0.8 of an inch. I know some people that will go all the way to 1 inch. So it really depends on, again, how much information you have to work with, how well can you make that white space, that visual balance in your resume. And then again, I'm looking at, okay, if I'm finishing a piece of work experience on the bottom of the first page, if I move the margins slightly, will that shift things around and make it look more appealing? That's something to keep in mind. We really tend to mess with those details, the spacing between lines, the margins, things of that nature, in an effort to make it visually appealing and make it the best user experience when you're looking at a resume. Hi, Josie. Yima, I'm sorry, but if you directly message TopResume, my colleague Jenna will definitely put you in touch with somebody who will help you with your resume issue. Josie, I did take many of the tips from Oh, Josie, congratulations. I'm so glad you got a full-time job. That's so exciting. I'm so glad the tips were helpful. Oh, that makes my day. Thank you so much. If you've just tuned in, my name's Amanda Augustine, and I'm the resident career expert for TopResume, as well as our sister sites, Top Interview and Top CV, and we are talking about the anatomy of a resume. I talked about kind of some of the 3 main things that a good resume will accomplish, that employers really like and favor. We talked about some basics, number of pages, page length, fonts, that sort of thing. A lot of people ask me about color. Can I add color to my resume? I'm not opposed to it. I just don't think you should have 5 different colors going on. Normally, if somebody really wants to add a little color to their resume because they want to spice it up, I'm not opposed to that, but I would say, okay, but pick one color to be kind of an accent and make sure that it's easy to read off of a white piece of paper. So you don't want to go with pale yellow. You don't want to go with orange. You don't want to go with something that's super, super light green, whatever. You want to stick to something that's going to have a good contrast against a white piece of paper so that it's easy for the person to read it. I've seen people go with dark purple. I tend to favor, shades of blue when I'm doing it. I know there's this ochre color that a lot of my resume writing pals at TopResume like to use, which also works because I truly think it's kind of unusual, so your resume tends to stand out. So things to keep in mind. Images, people ask me about, can I put in charts? I want to do visual representations of my work. I think that's great, but I think you need to save it for your personal portfolio. Put it on your online portfolio, your website. If you have an Instagram handle that's dedicated to showcasing all your work, if you have a blog, whatever it is, save that kind of imagery for there. The reason being that more often than not, your resume is going to pass through an applicant tracking system, and it can't read embedded images. It can't read the information you're trying to convey in those images. Even if you have a really cool stylized version of your name, that will be stripped out when it goes through those systems. Also, I've seen some things where it shows, these are my skills, and I put 4 out of 5 dots, 3 out of 4 dots, that sort of thing. It's very subjective, so it really doesn't help the reader truly understand and appreciate your skill level. So I tend to say stay away from that stuff. And if you are from a very creative field, you need to restrain yourself a little bit on the resume. The resume is a bit more of a cut and dry kind of document. Save that extra creativity for whatever online resource you are going to direct people to. And so let's talk about that. With that in mind, when we're talking about the top of your resume, think about the top third of your resume should always be a snapshot. It should give the reader an idea of who you are, what type of role you're looking for, and why you're qualified for that role in that quick snapshot. So think of that top third. When we talk about the fold of a newspaper or the fold on a page, the first part you'd see on a web page when you go to it on your laptop, the resume is very similar. We're talking about that top third section needs to be a snapshot. So what's included in that snapshot? At the very top, contact information. You want them to know who you are and how to get a hold of you. So you want your first and last name. You may include a middle initial, especially if you have a very common name or you've Googled your name and you find that there's somebody else out there that you do not want to be confused with. You may then want to consider putting a middle initial in or something like that to further differentiate yourself from those other individuals. If you have an advanced certification, an advanced degree, something that's considered desirable in your industry, maybe it's a PMP, maybe it's an RN, maybe it's your MBA. If you have any advanced degree, maybe you have Six Sigma Black Belt or Six Sigma Green Belt, I do recommend including the initialism, the abbreviation for that certification or advanced degree after your name at the top of your resume. Why? Because if you're not entry level and just getting into the workforce, the education portion of your information falls to the end of your resume. We don't want them to miss that. That's an important detail. So let's make sure it appears in that snapshot. So your full name, comma, and whatever initials or abbreviation for the degree or advanced certification, that's incredibly important. If it's just a bachelor's degree, an undergrad degree, that we don't typically add. That information isn't something we necessarily put in the top portion. Underneath your name, we're looking at basic contact information. One phone number, and I recommend it be your cell phone number, your mobile phone number. Make sure you have a voicemail on it that identifies who you are. You can decide how much information you want to give on your voicemail, but you do want a professional voicemail set up so that should an employer reach out to you, they know they got the right person, and hopefully, and again, this is their first communication with you. You want to make sure it sounds professional, it sounds friendly, and that it's setting the stage for their impression of you. You want your email address. And for those that are concerned about ageism, age discrimination, get rid of the Comcast email, get rid of the Optimum Online email, go with something that's a bit more modern because you don't want them to assume that you're not up with technology just because you never bothered to update your email address because you've had it forever. I actually recommend creating a new email address that is dedicated to your job search and networking activities. So it's one spot that you go for all your information. It's important messages aren't going to get lost in this huge inbox because it's part of your personal or your work or something like that. And that's another thing. If you're currently employed and looking for work, please never, ever, ever use your work email. I know it sounds silly. Why should I ever have to tell you that? Because I've seen it done and it has backfired and really burned some people. So something to keep in mind. Also, your LinkedIn profile URL. More often than not, employers are going to look for you on LinkedIn. Make sure they're going to the right place. So just include the URL to your LinkedIn profile. Of course, that means if you're doing that, you also have to make sure that your LinkedIn profile has been updated so that it's telling the same story that your new resume is going to tell. They need to be consistent in their messaging, in their positioning, because that's one of the reasons people look for you online. They're trying to confirm or validate that what they see on paper is real and it's a real person. So they're looking at these other resources to validate that. You want to make sure that when you are communicating your skills, your qualifications, your goals, that it's consistent online, in person, and on paper. So something to keep in mind. That has everything to do with how you name your companies, the start and end dates for them, how those dates are represented, how your name is represented. If you're going to use your middle initial on your resume, use it on your LinkedIn profile. Be consistent. One thing you do not have to include on your resume that used to be a given is your full mailing address. No need. It's not information that's required for most job applications. If they truly need to know your location, they'll make you fill it out in the application. You don't need to post it on your resume, because think about all the different places you send your resume out. Where have you published it? What job boards is it on? Nobody needs to know exactly where to find you at home. It's not a great idea. What I do recommend doing is that if you're looking for a role that's close to home and you want to show that you're a local candidate, then you want to put city, state, and zip. Given right now the current situation, yes, many businesses are starting to open up around the country. It really depends on what you do and that sort of thing. A lot of people are still working remote full time. It's almost kind of a moot point, but just keep that in mind. If you're planning to relocate for work, you can leave out the location information, and across the board, no one has to put their street address on their resume. The other things you might add to that section of your contact information: if you have an online portfolio, if you have a social media handle that is incredibly important to what you do, it represents your work, your expert advice or knowledge, that's where you'd want to place it all up in that contact information. And really think about which ones are that you're keeping active, current, updated, which ones are in alignment with your resume, your LinkedIn profile, that sort of thing. You don't want to put 17 resources up there. You don't want to overcrowd them. So Clara asked, what about a P.O. box address? If you're trying to demonstrate that you're a local candidate, I still don't think you need to put it on your resume. That was a I don't want to say a trick, but a technique that we used to use years ago. I remember that it's like, to demonstrate you're a local candidate, if you get a P.O. box in that city, so that you could demonstrate that you have an address there. I don't think it's as important these days, to be quite honest. You could still just put the city, state, and zip, and if in an application they require you to put in an address, then you could put in the P.O. box. That's fine. But truly, it's not really necessary at the very beginning. And I am interested to see how many companies start allowing more positions to work remotely after all this is done. And so I'll be interested to see really how much does location matter anymore. You used to have to flock to the cities for certain roles if you wanted those roles at those companies. I'm curious to see in what instances does that suddenly change after all of this. So Claire, if you want to put it on, you can, but don't feel obligated to. I don't think it's as necessary as it was, say, 10 years ago. I definitely remember providing that advice 10 years ago, 100%. You are quite welcome. Contact number. Yes, Mosine, you definitely want your phone number on there, but I'd stick to one phone number. Whatever is your mobile phone number where you control the voicemail. So we've gone through contact information. I know I'm going to run out of time, so I'm going to try, and way too much time is spent already. This could definitely be a 2-hour, 3-hour event. Let's talk about the top third section, the rest of that. professional title. I like to have a professional title, and I modify it based on the role that the person's applying for. And most of my writer friends do the same thing, where we'll put in a title and then we'll basically put a note in that says, hey, change this as you're applying for different jobs, so that it accurately reflects whatever role you're applying for, whether that's at the manager level or the director level, whether they say management or manager. You're just trying to mirror some of the language that you're seeing in the job description, so that your resume is more likely to resonate as, this fits the bill. This individual fits the bill for this role. If you are a career changer and you are going after a role you've never held before, it can feel weird to put a title at the top of your resume for a position you've never held. If that is a concern, you can actually write objective, and then put the name of the title, and then you can put a one-liner underneath that says blah 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 professional, looking to leverage these skills into this type of role, to set the stage before you go into the professional summary. It's sometimes called a subtitle or a subheader to the top of your resume. Professional summary, really important. It's called a professional summary, a professional statement. It has it can also be called an executive summary or an executive statement. What in the world is this? This is 3 to 5 lines, either in bullet form or in a paragraph form, that's considered the elevator pitch to your resume. It sets the tone, it summarizes very succinctly your skills, your qualifications, what makes you a good candidate for the role you're looking for. It also hints at the proof of your skills. And so you may say that you have X years of experience creating these things and that things, which resulted in increased brand awareness, expanded brand identity, blah, blah, blah. You're talking about some of the things, or hinting at what they're going to see in the rest of your resume that demonstrates, I have the skills that I'm talking about and I have proof of those skills down below. So whether it's, adept at working well with all levels of management, or translating technical information into layman's terms that, the average Joe can understand, that sort of thing, you're going to hint at information that you're then going to continue to validate further in your resume. That's the thing to keep in mind there. I'm partial to a paragraph, but I've also seen some of the other writers on our team focus on doing it bulleted form, and it's great. It works as well. It's truly what works based on the information that they have to work with. And so you can do it a couple different ways. I've also found the bullets to be helpful if somebody is trying to get back into work that they haven't done in a while, and so we know that the beginning part of their experience section isn't going to necessarily echo back to their skills that are relevant for the job that they're pursuing today. And so I often have seen, and I really like this, I think it's cool, if you take that professional summary and you kind of make it almost like a functional resume, where you label different skills that you possess and then give a short blurb about where you've leveraged that skill, or how you've accomplished something, or what output have you achieved leveraging that skill, and where did you use it. So you're giving them a kind of high level look at your skill set before they get into your experience. So that's another way to go about it. Then, more often than not, there's typically a section that goes into core competencies or areas of expertise. And this can either be lines across that are separated with symbols, or it can be columns with bullets. You're looking at typically 3 to 4 lines worth, where you're looking at the different job descriptions that interest you and you feel you are qualified to perform. And wherever they're talking about certain skills, certain knowledge levels, if you possess those and they're routinely popping up on all these different job descriptions, these are the terms that you incorporate into that section, because again, at a glance, you want the individual reviewing your resume to know that you possess this breadth of knowledge and skills and expertise that's required to do the job before they get into the meat of your resume, which is really that work experience section. If you're just joining me, my name is Amanda Augustine. I'm the career expert for TopResume and our sister sites Top Interview and Top CV, and today we're talking all about the anatomy of a great resume. So we've talked a lot about that top third, that snapshot, which is typically your contact information, a professional title, perhaps a subtitle, a professional summary that's, think of it as the elevator pitch, the career narrative, so to speak, major component of your resume, and then a core competency or areas of expertise section, which again, this whole thing is to give the reader at a glance a really good sense of who you are and what you're qualified, what type of role you're pursuing and why you're qualified to pursue that type of role. For some, if you're entry level, you would then go into your education section. If you're not fresh out of school, then the education is going to go to the end of your resume, and your next section would be work experience. You can define it as work experience, work history, professional experience, professional history. Those are kind of the main ones. For some people who are worked in a lot of different areas and they're trying to target a resume for a very specific area, they might even say relevant sales experience or something like that to further brand their resume and define, the type of role they're pursuing. But it's really a case-by-case basis for something like that. So I want to talk about the work history section because I think that is by far the part that is trickiest for most people, and give you some pointers on that. It's funny, I haven't really talked a lot about links to share, but we'll definitely get into those, in a little bit. Work history. The biggest rule to remember when you're talking about work history is show, don't tell. Don't just say you did something. Don't just list your responsibilities. Whenever possible, you want to try and demonstrate that you were good at what you did. Whether that's, you're a waitress and you got the best tables, the best, busiest area, you always got the best shift, you were asked to help mentor or train new hires, anything, you got employee of the month, whatever it might be, you were asked to work at the new location when it first started to help get it up and running. Those sorts of things demonstrate that you must be good at what you do. It was a seasonal job and you've been asked back for the past 3 seasons. That demonstrates that you're good at what you do. If you're in a role that's more quantifiable, think about how can you talk about increased responsibility? What have been your quarterly goals, your annual goals? Have you met them? Have you exceeded them? Have you brought projects in on time, ahead of schedule, under budget, on budget? Did you achieve, 110% of your sales quota? Did you expand the number of accounts you were working on? Were you given more P&L responsibility? Was the team that you were managing, did you get to grow it by X amount? Did you help your team achieve something? Wherever you can demonstrate excellence, so to speak, that's the most important part of the work history section. So when I do work history, I put in the company name, its location, and if there are multiple locations, that's fine. If I worked remotely, then I would put remote in parentheses next to my job title, but I'd put the company name. Sometimes I put a one-liner that will describe the company. Sometimes I don't. If whatever you decide to do, you have to be consistent with every job. So if all of the companies are kind of not well known, I might define all of them so the reader has a better context for both my job title as well as my industry. I go into my job title, and then I want to make sure I have my start and end dates. And if you have worked at the same company for a number of years and you had multiple roles within that company, you can either do each one of those out on its own. So you can do something about the company and then have a blurb about the most recent role and then work your way back. Or if it was a very quick succession of promotions, you might just list your most recent title and put, was quickly promoted from blah, blah to this role based on meeting X, Y, Z goals or excellence in X, Y, and Z areas, that sort of thing, and maybe just focus on the most recent stuff. But you do need to kind of account for those others. Sometimes I'll put the most recent title and the years of experience, and underneath it, I'll just put the other titles with the other dates, and then really only focus on the main one if that's the most important or the most relevant to what I'm doing now. It's really going to depend on what you have to work with, but there's a couple ways to go about it. More often than not, I put a short paragraph that describes my role and responsibilities. What was I responsible for doing on a daily basis, on an annual basis? And because I only have so much space to work with, I'm gonna focus on the information that's most relevant based on what I'm trying to do next. Then I like to save the bullets as my bragging points. That's something to keep in mind. Bullet points equal bragging points, or bullet points, bragging points. What's the most important information? It's the key accomplishments or the selected achievements, something of that nature. How can you then say, if this was my role and my responsibility, here's what I accomplished. Here's the output that I gave. If you can quantify that, that's always best. If you can't, then you just want to talk in terms of better, faster, more efficient, greater revenue, less costs, whatever it be. What's the value to the employer? Keep that in mind. What was your contribution or what was your accomplishment? Those are the things you want to highlight. If you're not in a role that kind of allows for that information, then instead I recommend focusing on not having the paragraph with roles and responsibilities, and instead just doing bullet points that are highlighting the most important parts of your job that demonstrate the knowledge that you've acquired while doing this role. Does that make sense? I know I'm talking very quickly because I want to get that across. When I do bullet points, I do a format that's called result by action. So I start that bullet point with the piece of information that's like achieved 150% of sales quota by implementing X, Y, and Z stuff, by repositioning blah, blah, blah. So start with the headliner and then talk about what actions you took to actually get there. Was awarded blah, blah, blah based on so-and-so. Does that make sense? Okay. So I'm gonna go back and really get into some of these questions because I know so Mohsen, I know you're trying to get her to share the resume. Jenna, if you could share the link that goes to all the resume samples that are on our blog. There's actually one that's for people with no experience, entry level, those that are internship level, those that just graduated from college. We have resume samples available for basically every level when you're looking for a job. We also have a really expansive article. There's 2 of them out there. I have a short one that's kind of the essential parts of a resume. So Jenna, if you could share that at some point. And then there's this other one that my colleague Carson wrote that's incredibly, incredibly detailed. It's super long, but it's everything and anything you could possibly want to know about the breakdown of a resume. It's kind of our 2020 guide to writing a resume. If you're looking for any information, if I did not get to it today, it is probably in there, or it hyperlinks out to the piece of information that you're looking for. So keep that in mind. Abby, I'm looking at your question right now. It says, one of the employees referring me to a company and asked me to write a letter explaining about me and my skills. So an employer is asking you to write a letter that's explaining you and your skills. So what I get from not knowing what the company is or what role you're looking for, what I get from that is they're actually looking for a little bit more insight into your personality and kind of what's driven you to this role beyond just looking at a resume where it is more of a black and white document. So one way, I mean, as we know, they like a compelling career narrative. I would think about how can you tell a story? And so I would think about, is there a certain experience that you can think of either on the job or in school where you had to deal with something and you had to use certain skill sets that are considered really important for the role you're going for today? I don't know if you see where I'm going with this, but the idea is if you can start it in a story where it kind of grabs their attention, where it's like, 2 years ago, I was faced with X, Y, and Z challenge, and this is what was going on, and here's what I had to do to solve the issue, and what I learned is that I'm actually really great at adapting, or I'm really great at blah, 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 and that's one of the many reasons why I feel that I'm very qualified for this type of role, and then maybe go into some of the other things. Always go back to the job description, similar to a cover letter, to be quite honest. Go back and look at the job listing, think about what you've learned about the role if you've spoken to anybody over the phone, and identify what are kind of those top 3 things they're looking for in the person who they hire to do this job, and you want to really focus in on those. From what I understand, you're looking for someone who can do X, Y, and Z. Here's how I meet each of those qualifications. And so I would almost think that that letter is a bit of how can you demonstrate a bit of your personality, why are you so interested in this role, how have you developed some of those skills, and then go into how do you meet the qualifications. Okay, looking for more questions. Oh, you're so welcome, Isabel. I'm glad this helps. If there are more questions, I will continue talking about some other parts of the resume that we didn't really get to. So I talked about at a high level the work experience section. There are a couple articles that, Jenna, if you could share, I'd really love to, because I think they're really important. There's one about being a doer versus an achiever, or how do you demonstrate that you're an achiever when you have a doer job. I think that one's really helpful. Either of those, because really when you think about the professional experience section, it's all about how do I demonstrate I'm good at what I do? How do I demonstrate that I was a very competent employee wherever I worked? And that will help you frame. I also have one that's how to brag on your resume without sounding like a jerk. And really the idea is, people have trouble bragging about themselves, but frankly, a resume is where you want to be tooting your own horn. That's where you want to be confident. That's where you want to demonstrate how great you are at what you do. And in order to do that, you really have to think about how are you describing your experience, and then how are you highlighting those accomplishments and contributions. And so I go piece by piece through the sections that I talked about. How do you create those bullet points? What do you put in that roles and responsibilities section? And I think that will be really helpful for a lot of people. For those of you that have over 15, 20 years of experience, keep in mind that you only want to focus on fleshing out the most recent 15 years of your experience. And then towards the end of your resume, after you go through those 15 years, you can either put a career note or you can create a subsection called earlier career experience, where you very briefly mention some of that information. I have an article that's on how many pages your resume should be. And it talks about not only what's kind of the ideal number, but when you're trying to get it down to that ideal 2-pager, how can you also include that earlier work experience? And I have samples of both versions. How do you do the career note? How do you do the earlier career experience? So that article will be really helpful for those that are looking for specific examples. We've got a few more minutes. Okay, let's talk about education. Let's talk about what else you can add to your resume. Obviously, education is important. Don't assume people will know you have a college degree if you have a college degree. You are going to add that information. What you call that header may differ. Some people call it education and professional development, education and training. You can put just education and make other subheadings underneath that. You always want to start with your most recent degree and work your way back. If you have specific certifications you've pursued, you want to include that information. If any of those were achieved outside of the last 15 years, then you're still going to put the information on, but you're not going to mention dates that you achieved that certification or that degree. So you still want to list that information, but not necessarily include the dates with it. Volunteer experience, professional memberships. The volunteer experience always goes over well with employers, so yes, feel free to put in any of your volunteer work. They love that. If it's professional associations, only if they're relevant to what you're doing. If you're completely pivoting to a different type of role and being a member of Mang is no longer important, if you're pursuing finance, then don't put it on. Always reevaluate your resume under the lens of your current job goals. For every piece of information you're adding, does it answer the question, so what, for the reader, for your target audience? Is everything that you're writing supporting your current goal, or is it just something that you really like? You're trying to streamline this document and really curate the information you include so that it's positioned and framed for the goal at hand. And for some of you who are looking for maybe short-term work now, you may have a very different look and feel to your resume for a short-term opportunity to get you through this season versus what your long-term goals are. And in that instance, I would say have two completely different resumes that you're working off of, one for something for your short-term strategy, one that's more for that long-term strategy. What else was there to include? I know we've only got a couple more minutes, but I know there was something else I wanted to add in there. Languages. If you speak multiple languages, I recommend noting that in your professional summary. Jenna, if we haven't shared the article on professional summary and ditching the objective statement, let's make sure we share that, because that includes examples. It's also all the extra things you might add to your professional summary based on your preferences and experience. So definitely note that you are bilingual or fluent in certain languages in your professional summary. Make sure you also state that towards the end of your resume, whether you're fluent, whether you're competent, there's different levels. You want to let them know if you're fluent, if you're a native speaker, that sort of thing, so they're aware of kind of your level. I would not include it on my resume if I didn't feel comfortable answering questions in that language. So if you took Spanish 101 in high school and it's been years and you're like, well, I could kind of read a few things, if you would feel very uncomfortable and out of your depth if you had to answer interview questions in that language or respond back and forth to emails in that language in a reasonable amount of time, then it doesn't belong on your resume. So that's something to keep in mind. If you're currently pursuing a degree but you haven't completed it yet, you do want to enter that information into your resume, but you might put that, degree expected in X year. Or anticipated 2021, whatever it may be. So yes, let them know that you're pursuing this degree or certification, and just kind of give them a sense of like, when's the end game for that. Other things to include: technical skills. And let's talk about that for a moment. If you are in a tech profession where you are a coder, your key skills section at the top of your resume is going to have a whole thing dedicated just to your tech skills, your tech specialties. Software, hardware, coding languages, all that kind of fun stuff. I'm not even going to pretend that I know it all. I actually personally don't really write tech resumes because I don't feel comfortable doing them. I just don't feel that I am well versed enough to do it. I know the basics. I can review one, that sort of thing, but it would take me a while to write what I would consider to be a really strong, solid tech resume, so I tend to shy away from those. Luckily, I have lots of colleagues that are very good at them, so I can pass them on to them to work on. But that tech information will be at the top. For somebody who's not in a tech field, at the bottom of or the end of your resume, you may have a section of skills that's showing like what platforms are you proficient on, and where do you get that information? Go back and look at all the job descriptions. What systems do they want you to have knowledge of? What systems are they expecting to have worked on? If you have, include that information in your resume. In the educational section, should we include certifications? Mohsen, 100% yes. If those certificates are relevant and support your current goals, 100%. The only other thing I wanted to bring up before we close, a lot of people have asked me about hobbies. Should I include hobbies? It's interesting because if you look at the top 10 kind of things that recruiters don't love, hobbies is at the very, very bottom of the list. So it's something that not all of them agree on. Here's kind of my take on, should you include hobbies, yes or no? Only include hobbies if they're very unusual, something that most people don't have on their resume, that, that's an unusual hobby that is going to provide insight into your personality and your character. Or traveling, cooking, reading, no. Sewing, no. Those are gardening, no. Those things aren't useful. If it's something that you'd like the average dating profile would have on it, then it doesn't belong on your resume either. Only if it's very unique, or if that hobby demonstrates a specific skill you have that's relevant to the role at hand. So if you do Toastmasters, or if you do, or you're a stand-up comic in your, spare time, and part of your role is in the role you're pursuing is in sales, where you have to be great at presentation, you have to have a great presence, you have to be a great people person, that sort of thing, then by all means put that on, because not only does it give some indication of your personality, but it's also demonstrating a certain skill you possess. So, but 100% do add it then. So if you're gonna put, hobbies on there, make sure they're not generic, and only include them if they demonstrate that you possess a certain skill or habit or personality trait that would be considered very relevant or desired in the field you're pursuing. I'm just gonna scan. You're very welcome. I'm happy to answer that. Just going back, Isabel, so glad you liked it. Clara, I'm so glad that helped. Just want to make sure I got to everybody's questions. Well, thank you all so much for, if anybody has any more questions, pop them in now, last chance. But otherwise, I'd love to say thank you so much for joining me today. Again, my name is Amanda Augustine. I'm the resident career expert for TopResume, as well as our sister sites, Top Interview and Top CV. And if you are looking to make some edits to your resume or CV, and you then want to know, well, how did I do? Don't forget to go to either TopResume or Top CV, depending on what countries you're targeting for your job search, and you can request a free review of your resume or CV, either at topresume.com or topcv.com, to get a better sense of where you stand. Thank you all so much, and I will see you soon. Take care, everyone.